At this point, most of you have at least heard of Netflix's series Tiger King. The series itself has spawned an entire internet subculture during quarantine. Articles, blogs, think pieces, opinion pieces, responses to opinion pieces, the list goes on. But the organizations represented in this briefing today, Animal Legal Defense Fund, Animal Welfare Institute, Born Free USA, Humane Society Legislative Fund, Humane Society of the United States, the International Fund for Animal Welfare, and the Performing Animal Welfare Society couldn't help but notice that the audience was not given the full story, and we'd like to change that. Our panelists have been working on these issues for decades and are here to walk you through the story of how big cats live in the United States. We'll begin with a discussion on the scope of the problem. How many big cats are there? Where are they being held and in what conditions? How bad does it get at roadside zoos? And what happens to the animals after they leave? Here to lead this first part of our discussion is Lisa Wathne. Lisa is the Senior Strategist for Captive Wildlife at the Humane Society of the United States. She began her career at the Progressive Animal Welfare Society in Washington State, where, among other campaigns, she worked to secure the relocation of Ivan the gorilla from a department store to Zoo Atlanta. For nearly 3 decades, her work is focused on the plight of captive wild animals, with an emphasis on legislation and policy for the past 10 years at HSUS. Also joining Lisa for this discussion are our panelists Angela Grimes and Kate Dylewsky. Angela is the Chief Executive Officer of Born Free USA, an international animal protection and wildlife conservation organization, and home to one of the country's largest wildlife sanctuaries, caring for more than 450 rescued monkeys. Prior to Born Free, Angela was Executive Director at Wildlife Rescue and Rehabilitation in Texas, a rehabilitation center for orphaned and injured native wildlife, and a sanctuary for a variety of species, including big cats such as lions, jaguars, and mountain lions. She currently serves on the National Board of Directors of EarthShare, a federation of leading environmental NGOs, and previously served on the boards of the Oklahoma Primate Sanctuary and Harmony House for Cats, a no-kill cat shelter in Chicago. Kate is the Senior Policy Advisor at the Animal Welfare Institute, where she handles wildlife policy at both the federal and state levels. Prior to AWI, Kate worked on legislative affairs at Born Free USA. At both organizations, she has advocated for bills to protect wild animals held in captivity, and she has been working on the Big Cat Public Safety Act for nearly a decade. Now, without any further ado, I'll hand the screen over to Lisa. Lisa, you're on mute.
Okay, is that okay? Okay, sorry about that. Thanks very much, Jennifer, and thanks to everyone who has tuned in to watch. If you watched Tiger King, you saw the very brief footage of a tiger cub being pulled under a fence and away from his mother just moments after he was born. It was a horrific scene, but really it's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the cruelty that is involved with using tiger cubs for public interactions. It's a practice that ultimately is the root cause of most of the problems we see regarding captive tigers in this country. The Humane Society of the United States conducted undercover investigations at 3 facilities that breed tigers and use the cubs for the public to pet and play with and be photographed with. Those facilities were Joe Exotics Zoo in Oklahoma, Tiger Safari in Oklahoma, and Natural Bridge Zoo in Virginia. Without exception, we found severe abuse and neglect at these facilities, and it was all in the pursuit of making money by offering tiger cubs for public interactions. The cruelty begins when the babies are torn away from their mothers at birth, and this is standard procedure at any facility that offers cub petting. After that, the cubs' lives were dictated exclusively by public handling schedules. These were babies who should have been nursing and bonding with their mother, playing with their litter mates, and sleeping a great deal. Instead, their sleep was constantly interrupted. They were fed irregularly and with food that lacked proper nutrition. And it didn't matter if they were tired or hot or thirsty or hungry or sick, they were made to sit still for a parade of paying customers. One of the facilities intentionally kept the cubs hungry until photo sessions began, and then fed them with a slow flow nipple so they would stay hungry until all the customers had been serviced. The babies were callously overhandled and they naturally resisted. They often screamed in distress as they were passed from person to person. And as they got older, they often scratched and bit as they tried to get away. When they wouldn't cooperate, they were physically disciplined by being punched and slapped and dragged and choked. Undercover assignments are logistically very difficult. And for our investigators, they are nerve-wracking and physically grueling. A typical day is a 10 to 12-hour shift, followed by several hours in a motel room, writing up log notes and uploading video footage. There's also the stress of witnessing ongoing cruelty and the perpetual fear of having their cover blown. Our investigation at Joe Exotic's place was especially stressful because Joe was so obviously unstable, and frankly, we considered him to be dangerous. But undercover investigations are critical for revealing the abuse that the public doesn't see, and our hope is always that the information we gather will ultimately lead to lasting change for animals. And we'd like to show a short video of footage from our investigations.
If they don't want to walk, pop him in the ass and make him walk. Okay? Sit down.
When that cat starts getting hard to handle, don't even hesitate to just pull it out. Because then is not the time to beat the shit out of that cat and make it listen.
You cannot reprimand a cat while the public's around. That happens behind the scenes.
Stop! Stay back.
You'll bite, okay? Aha.
Yeah, from Bill Meadows at Tiger Safari.
Bite the shit out of you.
You may have noticed that many of the cubs used for public handling are white tigers. Facilities pander to the public's attraction to white tigers and try to legitimize their intentional breeding of white tigers by claiming that these animals are very rare or nearly extinct. In fact, they're just an abnormal color variation of Bengal tigers. But in order to produce white tigers, the animals must be extensively inbred, which leads to congenital defects such as club feet, cataracts, crossed eyes, and hip dysplasia. South Carolina's Doc Antle, who was also featured in Tiger King and is one of the most prolific tiger breeders in the country, has admitted that he routinely euthanizes white tiger cubs who are born with crossed eyes. Finally, big cat cubs very quickly outgrow their usefulness and profitability. By the time they're 3 to 4 months old, they can no longer be used with public contact, so facilities continuously breed tigers in order to have a regular supply of cubs. And this has resulted in a huge surplus of captive big cats in the US. I'll now turn it over to Angela to take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Lisa, you addressed many of the important issues and the cruelty and abuse that happens in these cub petting and breeder situations, but unfortunately the cruelty doesn't end there. The cubs, when they outgrow their usefulness at around 12 weeks of age, are funneled into the exotic pet trade. They can be sold to another disreputable exhibitor, or they can end up in the black market for wildlife parts. Buying and selling big cats is as easy as ordering something on Amazon. Sales are conducted online, not on the dark web, but they are right out in the open, just like any other retail product. If you Google buy live tiger or buy lion cub, the first search page will turn up a number of results. Websites such as buytigers.com, exoticanimalsforsale.net. There's even wildanimalpets.com, which offers a bulk discount for buying. If you scroll through these sites, you can see right now white tigers for sale in Louisiana, serval kittens in Tennessee, a lioness in North Carolina. And those are just the straight up internet sales that were found in a minute or two of searching. This doesn't include the black market or breeders in some of the most prolific states such as Texas and Florida. In many cases, it can be easier to buy a big cat on the internet than it is to adopt a domestic cat from your local animal shelter. This can all be done online. No need to visit a shelter with your whole family and go through a screening process. You just hand over the money, sometimes from a few $100s to several thousand, and those cats will be delivered right to your door. In addition to this ease of purchasing, there's a lack of state laws and feeble regulations, when those regulations exist, that further perpetuates the trade in big cats. In the United States, there are 5 states that do not have a statutory or regulatory scheme that directly controls the keeping of big cats as pets. They might regulate some aspect of ownership, such as requiring health certificates, but that is the extent of that regulation. 13 states will allow big cats, but with a permit or license. And 13 other states also ban keeping some types of big cats, but not all types. There are 19 states that have a ban on keeping big cats as pets. And even with places that have restrictions, either regulations, licensing, permitting, or species restrictions, there are still ways to circumvent those state or local laws, such as applying for an exhibitor license with the USDA. This combination of the ease of purchasing and lax or non-existent state regulations means that anyone, including your next door neighbor, could have a tiger, a lion, a cougar, or even a chimpanzee or other dangerous animals living right next door to you, and they're cared for in inadequate and unsafe conditions that put people at the risk of injury or death. Since 1990, there have been more than 400 incidents involving captive big cats alone, and these are occurring in almost all of the 50 states in the District of Columbia. Big cats have killed 5 children and 20 adults and caused serious injuries and mauled many, many others. We all remember the tragedy in Zanesville, Ohio, when dozens of wild animals were released from a private menagerie. And to protect the public safety, law enforcement had to track and kill those animals, including 18 Bengal tigers. There are more recent incidents. Just last October, an escaped serval killed a dog and terrorized the neighborhood before being shot by police. In Florida, a mountain lion, part of a birthday party show meant to be fun, killed a 4-year-old attending that party, and that same year, tiger used for photo ops at a county fair in New York gashed the arm of a 2-year-old toddler. This private possession of big cats and the lack of strong regulation against it is a deadly scenario. Vanity, the search for that perfect Instagram-worthy photo, is a human health and safety risk, and it's happening all across the United States. And it's time for a very strong federal law to protect all of us. I'm now going to pass the baton to Kate. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. As you just heard, Angela and Lisa addressed the implications of cub petting and the pet trade in big cats in the United States. I want to turn now to the international implications of these activities that are happening within the US. And I want to start by addressing the myth that there are any conservation benefits to the rampant breeding that Lisa described. For those of you who saw Tiger King, you may have noticed one of the roadside zoo owners comment that breeding captive tigers in the United States is exactly what we need to get them off the list of endangered species. His point was, why wouldn't we want more tigers? That's an entirely inaccurate misconception. Not a single one of these tigers that are bred in the United States can ever be released back into the wild. After generations of inbreeding, they don't have the genetic makeup of wild tigers, and they couldn't be assimilated back into that population. A really good example of that are the severely inbred and deformed white tigers that Lisa mentioned. In addition, after being reared in a cage for their entire lives, they don't have the survival instincts that are necessary to survive in the wild. So, contrary to what was stated in Tiger King, more cats in the US doesn't equal better conservation outcomes. It just equals more suffering for the cats that are here. Secondly, not only do these roadside zoos not benefit conservation efforts, they actually harm them. As Angela pointed out, a lot of these big cats that outgrow their use at cub petting operations are funneled into the exotic pet trade. That's not the only place that they go, though. We have reason to believe that some of them are also killed, and their parts are sold in the lucrative international black market trade, particularly to countries where items like tiger bone and tiger wine are extremely prized. And finally, the magnitude of the big cat problem we have here in the United States is actually harming our diplomatic and conservation efforts abroad. Officials with the State Department and NGOs that work on an international scale have reported that when they try and negotiate with other countries to do things like shut down tiger farms in China, the response that they get from these other nations is that they're unwilling to consider those proposals because the United States won't address the problem that it has within its own borders. And so why should any other country take advice from us? And these nations are right. It's hypocritical. If we want to improve our conservation efforts abroad, and if we want to bust the myth that roadside zoos actually help the survival of wild species, we need to get a handle on the breeding and trade of big cats here in the United States. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kate. Once we know how a facility is treating their big cats, what can we do to rescue them? The answer can take years. In 2014, the Animal Legal Defense Fund successfully brought a lawsuit under the Endangered Species Act against Roadside Zoo Cricket Hollow Animal Park for mistreating protected animals such as tigers and lions. Here to speak more about this and other similar cases is Matthew Liebman from ALDF. Matthew is the Director of Litigation for ALDF and works on all aspects of Animal Legal Defense Fund's civil cases. He has litigated several landmark cases, including numerous cases involving captive wildlife. In July, Matthew will join the faculty of the University of San Francisco Law School as its first ever Justice for Animals Endowed Animal Law Chair. Matthew graduated with distinction from Stanford Law School in 2006 and with highest honors from the University of Texas at Austin in 2001 with a degree in philosophy. Matthew has also clerked for the Honorable Warren J. Ferguson of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Take it away, Matthew.
Thanks, Jennifer. So the Animal Legal Defense Fund uses civil litigation to fight the abuse and neglect of animals, including big cats at roadside zoos and in private ownership. And so I want to talk about a couple of litigation campaigns that we've worked on against facilities, both of which incidentally have connections to Joe Exotic, that exemplify the problems associated with the big cat trade, including breeding, including direct contact, and inhumane captivity. The next slide, please. The first of these involves a tiger named Tony, who was housed at a gas station. He was in the parking lot of a truck stop in Grosset, Louisiana, that was owned by this guy, Michael Sandlin, who from 1988 until 2017, almost 3 decades, kept tigers confined at his truck stop. And the truck stop is near Baton Rouge, near LSU. And so essentially he was piggybacking off of the popularity of their mascot, the tiger, as a gimmick to sell gasoline. And in 2001, he obtained a little cub named Tony, who at that point was 6 months old. And Tony would continue to languish there at the Tiger truck stop for the next 17 years, despite almost a decade of litigation that I worked on with the Animal Legal Defense Fund in an effort to free him. Next slide, please. And I'd hope we can agree that a truck stop is no place for a tiger. As you can see from this image, the truck stop was right off of Interstate 10 and very adjacent to the highway. And so Tony was constantly exposed to both the noise of traffic on the highway, as well as the sound of idling trucks in the parking lot of the truck stop. And tigers, of course, are predators, so they have a very acute sense of hearing. And so the constant exposure to rumbling noises was quite torturous for Tony. He was also exposed to the smell of diesel exhaust, and the cage was right in the parking lot. And so he was separated from visitors by just a couple of layers of chain link fence. And so people would often try to get him to interact with them. Tigers actually sleep quite a bit, as many as 20 hours a day. So people who would pull off the highway to see the tiger often found him sleeping. And in an effort to get him to do something interesting, they would yell at him. We even had reports of people flicking lit cigarette butts into his cage to try to burn him, to get him to jump up and roar. So it was really quite an inhumane captivity for Tony. Fortunately, in 2006, the state of Louisiana decided to pass a ban on the private possession of big cats. But they included a grandfather provision and then issued a grandfather permit to Michael Sandlin on the grounds that he had already legally owned his tiger at the time that the ban went into place. In fact, that wasn't true. He was in violation of a local ordinance, a municipal ordinance that also prohibited private ownership of big cats. So in 2010, the Animal Legal Defense Fund filed a lawsuit against the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, arguing that they had unlawfully issued a permit to someone who was not eligible. The trial court agreed with us, and that decision was affirmed on appeal. And so we had an injunction against the State Department of Wildlife and Fisheries from issuing any further permits to the Tiger truck stop to maintain Tony's captivity. That should have been the end of it. Tony should have gone to a sanctuary. But unfortunately, that wasn't the end of the story. Next slide, please. So despite our legal victory, Tony remained in captivity because the state of Louisiana decided to pass a new retroactive law. It was essentially a one-person exemption where they retroactively exempted Michael Sandlin and Tony the tiger from the prohibition on big cat ownership. It was really, I think, a testament to the kind of undue influence that roadside zoos can have over the state legislative process. and illustrates the need for comprehensive federal legislation. And in fact, at these hearings, we see Joe Exotic sitting side by side with Michael Sandlin in an effort to get this exemption passed. And in fact, it did pass, and Tony was continued to stay confined at the Tiger truck stop. Next slide, please. We did file another lawsuit to challenge the constitutionality of that exemption law. We challenged it under a provision of the Louisiana Constitution that prohibits special interest laws that give exemptions to one person, which is what that was. But unfortunately, before that new lawsuit could be decided, Tony died in his cage in October of 2007. And so he ended up living almost his entire life, 17 years, as a roadside attraction in this small, inadequate cage. And it's really quite, and I think, a testament against private ownership of big cats. Next slide, please. The next case I want to talk about, or series of cases, has a somewhat happier ending. And this is the litigation that Jennifer mentioned against the Cricket Hollow Zoo. And as you can see from this picture, this is a dilapidated roadside zoo. It's located in Manchester, Iowa. And it held hundreds of animals, including several big cats, tigers, African lions, mountain lions, in really deplorable conditions. You can see here the sort of filth that animals were confined, doubled as a dairy farm. Next slide, please. Here's a photo of the Tiger Enclosure, which, as you can see, is quite small and unenriched. There's nothing green in there. And the conditions of the facility, including the tigers, were documented repeatedly in inspection reports by the United States Department of Agriculture pursuant to the Animal Welfare Act. And they repeatedly documented feces accumulation within the cages, lots of filth, inadequate space for the animals, insufficient veterinary care, as well as untreated injuries and illnesses in many of the animals, including the tigers. Next slide, please. The facility also engaged in breeding of their big cats and then would use the cubs for public contact. They offered what they called tiger time, which for $20, you could have essentially unsupervised time cuddling with one of the tiger cubs. Among the many animals that died at the Cricket Hollow Zoo were 4 tigers: Casper, Luna, Mirage, and Raoul. And in fact, Raoul was one of the cubs who was used in the petting encounters. But despite all of these USDA inspection reports that documented inadequate conditions for animals, despite repeated complaints from local residents, both state and federal regulators refused to take any action to stem the tide of abuse at the Cricket Hollow Zoo. And so the Animal Legal Defense Fund and its clients, 2 sisters, Lisa and Tracy Keel, who lived near the zoo, filed a lawsuit under the Endangered Species Act. And in that case, we argued that the inhumane treatment of the captive endangered animals, including the tigers, as well as some lemurs at the facility, violated the Endangered Species Act's prohibition on taking endangered animals, which is harming them or harassing them. After a lengthy trial, we won that case. That was also affirmed on appeal by the 8th Circuit, which set the groundbreaking precedent that the protections of the Endangered Species Act apply not only to animals in the wild, but also to endangered animals who are held in captivity. And so the kind of routine abuse that the tigers were subjected to at Cricket Hollow Zoo violated the Endangered Species Act. We ended up filing a second lawsuit after lions were added to the endangered species lawsuit, and 2 lions, Janwa and Injara, were sent to the Wild Animal Sanctuary in Colorado, where incidentally dozens of Joe Exotic's tigers now reside. And then we've ended up filing a third lawsuit for the remaining non-endangered animals who were left to suffer at the Cricket Hollow Zoo. And that case was premised on state law. That was a state law claim arguing that the inhumane treatment of animals, including mountain lions, at Cricket Hollow Zoo was so egregious that it actually violated the state's criminal animal cruelty law and therefore constituted a public nuisance. That case also went to trial, and the trial court agreed with us and ordered the facility permanently shut down and ordered all the animals sent to sanctuaries. So a happier ending there than what we had for Tony. And I think there's several lessons that we can draw from these pair of campaigns. The first is that the current legal regime makes it far too easy for people to own, breed, handle, and abuse big cats. The second is that private individuals and unaccredited roadside zoos are incapable and or unwilling to provide the kind of care that captive big cats need. The third lesson is that state law is often insufficient, as we learned in Tony's case. There are too many loopholes to prohibitions, and often state lawmakers lack the political will to do something about this very serious problem. And then finally, the Cricket Hollow Zoo case demonstrates that existing federal law is often inadequately enforced, and so we think it shouldn't take years of litigation by concerned citizens and public interest organizations to stop the kind of abuse that we see at the Tiger Truck Stop and the Cricket Hollow Zoo. And so I think what we need is comprehensive federal regulation of these facilities. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Jennifer.
Thanks so much, Matt. Great presentation. Just to remind folks, we're having more people chime in. As I said at the top, if you have a question at any time, please use the question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen. Thank you. Here now to lead a discussion on the physical rescuing of animals is Meredith Whitney from the International Fund for Animal Welfare. Meredith worked for 7 years in an AZA accredited zoo as a keeper and later as a collection and conservation manager. She later served as the Chief of Environmental Quality for the U.S. Air Force in Japan, where she worked on efforts to contain the effects of the Fukushima nuclear crisis in 2011. She has also worked for the U.S. Embassy in Haiti, where she rescued street dogs. With IFA, Meredith has led projects on rescuing big cats in captivity in the U.S. and rehabilitation of leopards in Kenya. She has advised on rehabilitation projects for citizens, primates, and a variety of other taxa, and has responded with IFA's disaster response teams to provide care for wildlife and domestic animals impacted by disasters. Thank you, Meredith. The screen is all yours.
Thanks, Jennifer. So far what we've learned is the best case scenario for these animals that are in these exploitive situations is rescue, which sounds very simple, but rescue is not where the story ends. Rescues can be a long, expensive, and complex process. And so I want to dive a little bit into that with you. Next slide, please. So the timeline for rescues depends very much on the type of case we're looking at. In the case of individual owners who are surrendering animals that they can no longer care for, it may be a very simple call of, can you come get this animal? Yes, we can, and then it's done. But a lot of times, these can be situations where it requires multiple calls over many years, maybe several visits out to the site, and a lot of hand-holding to make these owners comfortable with letting go of animals that they love very much, but cannot care for properly. And then in the case of confiscations, especially when the courts are involved, we're usually looking at potentially years and years of planning and waiting as the case goes through the appeals process. And in the meantime, sanctuaries who are identified in advance to receive the animals should the case go with or end with the confiscation, these sanctuaries are keeping space available for these animals, and they are maybe turning away other animals that can use those space to make sure that they're available when the case is finally decided. So the next step is getting an animal inventory, which sounds pretty straightforward, but unfortunately, this may be very difficult without USDA inspections that require inventories, without permits from cities or states. We just don't know how many animals some facilities have. Furthermore, USDA inspectors, sometimes when they go to do an inspection of a facility, they may not be allowed to see all of the animals, so their inventory may not be complete, or they may not be allowed on the property at all, and we get no inventory. Furthermore, when we go to try to physically inventory the property to see how many animals are there, we find that animals are often tucked away and hidden in little corners and sometimes very difficult to find. When we do a rescue, human safety is our top priority. Animal safety is our next priority. And when we are moving animals, dangerous animals, out of enclosures for these rescues, there is always a heightened risk that a human or an animal can get injured. Furthermore, we're often dealing with compromised enclosures with no lockouts, so that we can safely lock the animal into a smaller enclosure when we enter. Sometimes facilities where the walls are too short and animals could get out if they chose to. And then sometimes we see facilities where they are just mazes and we can't tell where one enclosure stops and another enclosure begins, or how many animals are in that enclosure. And then we're also sometimes facing angry owners as well as we enter properties. When we look at loading plans for facilities, the ideal situation is to have animals voluntarily crate for transport. That can be accomplished sometimes by luring them into transport containers with food. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes they won't load at all, in which case they have to be chemically immobilized, which is a very risky situation. Even when you're dealing with experienced veterinarians, they have to visually estimate the weight of the animal to get the proper dosage. If it's a hot part of the day, things can go very wrong, because big cats, when they are chemically immobilized, have difficulty regulating their body temperature. And then if you have an animal whose health is compromised in other ways, that chemical immobilization can provide even more risk to them. So the other thing is for our medical plan, one of the big hurdles often is finding a qualified vet in the state of the rescue to provide the care. Veterinarians have to be licensed in the state in which they're practicing, so a sanctuary can't just bring their own vet onto a rescue site and have them provide the veterinary care. It has to be someone local. And if the drugs that are required can't be sourced locally as well, those have to be brought in from out of state, which is another difficult process at times. Transportation has to be arranged in advance as well, and that doesn't mean just securing a vehicle to move the animals, but it also means making sure that your transport vehicle can make it down the road to the property. It means making sure that there is a way to get your transfer crates to the enclosures that the animals are in, and if not, then you know you have to chemically immobilize that animal and carry it to your transport crate where it can then be loaded on the truck. And then once on the road, we have to identify places for stops for health checks on the animals, bio breaks for the people transporting them, overnight stops. And then the laws for transport differ from state to state. For example, in Florida, the transporter is required to have an active state fish and wildlife permit to hold the animals that they're transporting, which if your sanctuary that's doing the rescue is from, say, Texas, but they're doing the rescue in Florida, someone from Florida has to be there to assist for that. Whereas in other states like Louisiana, nothing is required to transport dangerous carnivores across state lines as long as the transit time is less than 24 hours. So rescuers have to be familiar with the laws in every state that they're passing through. In addition, we need documentation. We need the USDA health certificates, any state paperwork, and any other local documentation that may be required. And all of this that I've just listed is for the simple cases. So once you get into a more complex rescue, maybe a multi-day operation, you're now looking at questions about where will everyone stay, how will they eat during the rescue, where will they have basic hygiene functions. We need to talk about communications. How are all the different sanctuaries that may be coordinating going to communicate? And if law enforcement is also involved, how are we communicating with law enforcement? Does everybody's walkie-talkie work on the same frequency? Do we have each other's cell phone numbers? And then we have to coordinate the activities with law enforcement. In case of a seizure, law enforcement should clearly go in first to serve the warrants and secure the property. But animals are likely to be agitated, and this is a time of great risk for law enforcement officers. And so sometimes they need someone with the animal experience to go in with them to provide some safety oversight to make sure that no one is being put at unnecessary risk. And this is just a high-level overview of the logistics that go into this. Our rescue checklist that we use is actually 7 pages long. And this is why rescues should be conducted by qualified, experienced sanctuaries, transporters, and coordinates to make sure that they're successful. It can't just be anyone off the street. So now you have an idea what goes into planning. I want to show you what happens during a typical medium-sized rescue. So can we get the next slide, please? In 2014, IFA was asked to coordinate on a rescue in New York State. This was a roadside zoo. They called themselves a sanctuary, but they were breeding and buying animals, so they don't really qualify as a sanctuary. They had had multiple Animal Welfare Act violations. The USDA eventually pulled the license of one of the owners, who then passed, another owner then got the license, but eventually all the licenses were pulled, and at that point in New York, it was illegal for them to hold these animals without those licenses. So the state decided to go in and confiscate because the owner would not surrender. IFA staff accompanied the police onto the site to serve the warrant, to assess the likelihood of an animal escape, and to help talk to the owners because they did expect resistance and possible violent resistance from the owner. In the end, the owner complied with the warrant and did surrender the animals. In this picture, with the law enforcement, the top picture, you can see those enclosure fences are not 12 feet high. Now, 12 feet is what we consider a safe height to contain tigers. And a lot of times what happens in these facilities is the animals grow up in these enclosures and they can't get out when they're young, so they stop trying eventually. But when something traumatic is happening, like all these people coming onto the property and moving animals, those animals may suddenly learn that they can get over those fences, and that puts everyone there at risk. So again, this was a moderate sized rescue with 46 participants and extremely expensive. The costs that you see there do not include the rescue costs that were incurred by the sanctuaries after the rescue for veterinary bills and for building enclosures. And these are nonprofits that rely on donors for all of their funding. For a smaller rescue, maybe one animal voluntarily surrendered being transported a short distance, you'd be looking at a cost of still about $3,000. So let's go to the next slide. So it's important to note that law enforcement officers and even most fish and wildlife or fish and game officers are not trained for this type of work, nor should they have to be trained for this type of work. A lot of times we are looking, as you see here, at very compromised enclosures that put everyone, including the animals, at risk. And law enforcement may not be familiar with large carnivore behavior, or even, what type of caging is actually secure or insecure, where some of the risks can come from. And it all just adds up to a lot of danger for everyone involved. Next slide. So I want to tell you next one rescue story, and this is the story of Blackfire. This Blackfire came from a pay-for-play zoo in Colorado. Blackfire in this picture is the animal on your far right. This facility was purchased by Turpentine Creek Wildlife Rescue and an organization called Tigers in America in 2016. And they purchased the facility with the purpose of closing them down. Interestingly, Jeff Lowe had tried to purchase the facility before them, but did so unsuccessfully. And that was shortly before he bought into Joe Exotic's facility. This zoo had about 100 big cats. This is a flyer from their cub petting operation that was still on the premises at the time that Turpentine Creek went in and did the rescue. Next slide. So before buying the facility, Turpentine Creek went to assess the animals there, and they found Blackfire alone in a concrete cage, unable to walk and mewling from pain. At the time, Blackfire and her siblings were just 4 months old. They had just recently aged out of being used for cub petting, but previous to this had likely been used daily for cub petting, despite the fact that they couldn't walk. This picture was taken shortly after the rescue, after Turpentine Creek took over the facility. And this is Blackfire with her two siblings, Peyton and Rocklin. All of them had similar problems walking. During the initial site visit, Rocklin and Peyton could walk, but by the time that turpentine took over, none of them could. Next slide. I should also point out that they were not the only animals at that facility that had untreated medical conditions. So all three of those cubs were x-rayed. This is Blackfire during her x-ray. So let's go to the next slide. This is her x-ray. Each one of those arrows points to a fracture. There were fractures in all four of her limbs and in her pelvis. You can also see at the top of the screen some impacted bowel. All of this was the result of metabolic bone disease, which is a condition when animals don't get enough calcium, their bones are too weak, and even just the weight of their own body can fracture those bones. One of the reasons that animals could get metabolic bone disease is not being fed enough formula or being fed watered down formula. And of course, this is another strategy that can be used to keep these animals hungry during cub petting sessions, so that visitors will be able to bottle feed them. Blackfire and her sisters were the first three animals that were removed from this facility. They were brought back to Turpentine Creek, where there was a debate about whether or not they could survive and whether it would be best and more humane to simply euthanize them. Turpentine Creek took the decision to try to undertake treatment, and in the first 6 months alone, they spent $10,000 on veterinary costs, formula, solid diet, supplements, stool softeners, and pain medications for these animals. And luckily, all three recovered. Can we get the next slide? This is Blackfire about 6 months after her rescue. All of the cats are still healthy, and they may have some bone deformities and they have some health issues that will last a lifetime, but they're now able to not just walk, but to run. And this is why sanctuaries do these rescues. So thank you, and I will pass it back to Jennifer.
Thanks so much, Meredith. Really glad to end on a happier note. Once the animals are rescued from the truly awful situations we've now heard about, what then? They'll need someplace to go, someplace that will be responsible for their health and well-being for the rest of their lives. What we're talking about are legitimate sanctuaries, like the Performing Animal Welfare Society, or PAWS, and Born Free's Primate Sanctuary. Here to speak more about this is Ed Stewart, president and co-founder of PAWS. Ed co-founded the Performing Animal Welfare Society in 1984 to advocate and provide sanctuary for abused, neglected, or retired wild animals from zoos, circuses, and the wild animal trade. PAWS operates 3 captive wildlife sanctuaries in California, including Ark Zoo, a 2,300-acre natural habitat refuge for elephants, big cats, and bears. Mr. Stewart serves on the Director's Advisory Committee on the Humane Care and Treatment of Wild Animals for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Advisory Committee for the Detroit Zoological Society Center for Zoo Animal Welfare. He has managed captive wild animals for more than 35 years. Thanks very much, Ed. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and thanks everybody for coming together today. On behalf of the Tigers, the Netflix show that was on, the series that was on last month, was a surprise to a lot of people in the country and around the world. It was not a surprise to me. I've seen this kind of activity for the last 36 years. We started PAWS. Pat Derby and I started in 1984. And the very first time we were called out to a tiger and lion situation in Louisiana, there were all of the same elements that you saw in the Netflix show. There were felons, there were drugs, there were judges and courts, there was criminal time in prison, and there were guns. We were actually shot at. First time we went on a rescue. We maybe should have wrapped it up right then, but we persevered for the last 36 years. Those were tigers that were left by themselves when a man went to prison for actually stealing other white tigers, which were very, very valuable at that time. So this is not a new situation. It's, you know, I've always said that you rarely find anybody with a kid at Stanford who has a tiger breeding in their backyard. Usually it's somebody who has a problem. There's always something else that you find when you go into a situation like this: drug abuse, domestic violence, child abuse. One of the hardest things, probably the hardest thing we ever did as an organization right after 2000 was a situation right here in California, which is embarrassing to say that, but there were 150 tigers at a facility in Southern California. And a man that had been running that situation for years and years, 20 years, was always on the edge of going out of business and having to put his tigers elsewhere. We knew he was a problem. Fish and Wildlife knew he was a problem. The state knew he was a problem. The USDA knew he was a problem. And one day he exploded. He had 150 tigers. And when the authorities finally got in there to inspect, 90 tigers were dead. They were in all different situations of decay around the property. There were 58 baby tigers that had died and were put into a freezer. It was an embarrassing situation. I ironically heard about it when I was in Cambodia trying to help them, the Cambodian government, with their roadside zoo problem. And so it was an embarrassing thing to see that right in my own nation and my own state, the same kind of thing was happening. And so we told the authorities we would take the last 39 tigers that they couldn't place in other sanctuaries because everybody fills up. There aren't a lot of places for these tigers. So when the rescue is over and the litigation is over and the man goes to jail for 4 months for child endangerment, then you have to deal with the cats for the next 15, 20 years. These cats were the oldest, the weakest, and the sickest of all the cats that were at his facility. And when we took them, it was a monumental move. I don't think anybody has ever done a rescue with 39 cats like that. We had to build an enclosure. We had to build the basic elements that you need: the den boxes, the watering, the pools, everything that you need to maintain the tigers. And since then, it's cost us over $3 million to care for those cats. And ironically, we don't get any government funding. We don't get state funding for something like that. We don't get funding from the federal government. We didn't even apply for the PPP loan. But so we have saved the government millions and millions of dollars by not just taking the 39 cats from Colton, California, but also many other cats around the country and other animals too. We have flown elephants from different states to our sanctuary in California, but by far the hardest thing we've ever done is try to figure out how to take 39 tigers. And we accomplished it somehow, and they lived a long, healthy life. It cost an incredible amount in vet care when they get older. And so we knew that back in 1984 that the answer to this problem was not to house the animals that you rescue. You have to turn off the spigot. You have to turn off the tap. And I think we're at a place right now where we're in a position where we can help do that. If we act right now within the next year or two, we can get the problem started in the right direction to be solved. In 20 years, this problem could be gone. It could be over. I think anytime somebody sees a tiger in a cage, whether it be at a zoo, a roadside zoo, a petting zoo, it teaches disrespect. You know, there's no state-of-the-art keeping an apex predator enclosed. These tigers will spend 15 or 20 years, their entire life, without doing their job. They're supposed to hunt the weak and the old and the young animals to make populations healthier in the wild. These animals will never do that. And so it's not fair to put them in a situation where they're basically unemployed. The first time somebody pets a wild tiger, I will say it's okay to pet a tiger. Obviously, there's a process that you have to go through. You have to steal the babies from the mother. It has to be confusing for the mother to give birth and not have her litter with her after that. And it's something that I think in 2020 should not be happening in this country. If a zoo's going to take a tiger and they're going to exhibit tigers, they have a fundraiser, they have an architect, an engineer, they plan it, they do all kinds of events and public announcements, and the last thing they do is get the tiger. In a sanctuary, the tiger is waiting in a facility where it could escape, it could be injured, it could be harmed, and it's an emergency every time. And there's no way to plan for the next animal that might have to come to your facility. So the answer isn't to house all of these tigers. You have to make sure you're not a facilitator. You're not taking animals from someone who is just going to create more baby tigers. If you see a sanctuary versus a pseudo sanctuary is what we call them. A pseudo sanctuary will take animals from other breeders and exhibit them and use them and keep accepting young babies. They trade, they buy, they sell, they have a weak conservation message. If you go to a real sanctuary, they tell you about the problem of captivity and the problem that's going on and the problem that you saw on the Netflix show. It's a very big responsibility to take these animals and try to care for them. We have the best vet care. We have the best staff. It's a very difficult job. And honestly, every sanctuary out there right now who takes a dog, a cat, a tiger, is solving a problem. And if you solve that problem, you can go out of business. You know, we've been, from the very first day we started, PAWS back in 1984, we've been trying to put ourselves out of business. And I think we're getting close to solving a problem here. And I think that you have to be careful of who you support, what kind of a sanctuary you support. We're part of an organization called the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, has very rigid financial restrictions. You have to have a good business plan. Your board has to be active and intact and credible. And you have to be able to take care of the animals in the best fashion you can. And the regulations for keeping the animals is very strict. Now, in saying that, you also are putting animals in cages or enclosures or habitats or whatever you want to call them, just like the people that are breeding them. So sometimes you take a lot of heat. You know, it's not our job to euthanize these animals. We try to give them a decent life for the rest of their life and try to give them some respect. But you know, a lot of people ask the question, what's the difference between an animal in a cage at a sanctuary and an animal in a cage in a roadside zoo? And really, there a lot of times can be no difference. The difference is that we are not proliferating this problem. You know, we're trying to solve the problem. And whether the enclosure is an acre, 2 acres, 3 acres, you're opening yourself up for some criticism, and you know what? We'll take that criticism because we're trying to actually do something for the tigers in the long term. So I think our message is save the habitat, you know, the term endangered species really means nothing for these tigers. We came up with the term endangered species. We should have come up with the term endangered habitat. If we came up with that, we'd be shooting at the right target. We'd be spending resources and energy on saving their habitat where they normally would live. And what we've done is create a situation where they can be exploited from the very first day they're born till they die when they're 15 or 20 years old. So thank you for your time, and I'll entertain any questions later.
Thank you so much, Ed. Thanks very much. We have now learned that there are thousands of captive big cats in the United States, the majority of whom are not receiving proper care, and many who are being mistreated and abused. Sanctuaries offer a respite for these animals, but as Ed has already told us, while they can improve the welfare of individual animals, sanctuaries alone won't solve the overall problem. Much larger solutions are needed. Here to discuss that again is Kate Dylewsky, Senior Policy Advisor at the Animal Welfare Institute.
Thanks, Jen. So now you've all heard about the scope of the big cat problem in the United States. So I'm sure the question on everyone's mind is, okay, well, what do we do about it? And one component of the solution to this problem is a federal bill called the Big Cat Public Safety Act. Now, this bill was introduced in the House this Congress by Representatives Mike Quigley and Brian Fitzpatrick, and it was introduced in the Senate by Senator Richard Blumenthal. And this is a strongly bipartisan bill. We're quite proud to already be up to 229 co-sponsors in the House. And this piece of legislation amends the Lacey Act to accomplish two things. First of all, it prohibits the private possession of big cats. Big cats in this bill encompass lions, tigers, leopards, cheetahs, jaguars, cougars, or any hybrid of these species. And by private possession, we mean someone like you or like me who decides it would be a really great idea to keep a tiger in our basement or in our backyard. The entities that are exempt in this bill include everyone who has a Class C exhibitor's license. So that includes every single zoo in the United States, because every zoo has to have that license. The bill also exempts reputable sanctuaries, state universities, and veterinarians. In addition, current owners of big cats are grandfathered in. So if this bill passes, no one is going to have to give up their privately owned big cat. They would simply have to notify the government that they have that big cat so that law enforcement has a sense of where these dangerous animals are located, and they wouldn't be able to breed or acquire any new big cats. So that's the first thing the bill does. The second thing it does is that it prohibits direct contact between the public and big cats. And you've heard a lot during this webinar about cub petting and photo ops, the rampant breeding that is needed to sustain those operations, and why that's so problematic. So the bill really wants to get at the root cause of the proliferation of big cats in the United States, and it does that by prohibiting that direct contact. Now, this bill is not only supported by groups like ours that are interested in protecting the welfare of these big cats. It's been endorsed by a very wide variety of stakeholders, which include groups like the Association of Zoos and Aquariums and a large number of its member zoos. It's also been endorsed by groups like the National Sheriff's Association, the Fraternal Order of Police, the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, the Sheriff's Association of Texas, the National Animal Care and Control Association, and individual law enforcement officers, as well as a long list of sanctuaries that are behind this bill. And this enormous support really demonstrates how many constituencies are affected by the problem of big cat ownership and big cat breeding in this country. So to shed some more light on the support behind this bill, I want to share with you all a video from the sheriff he's the sheriff in Zanesville, Ohio, and that's where the incident that Angela mentioned happened in 2011, where 38 big cats were released from a private farm into a residential area, and the local sheriff's department was forced to respond. So I'll turn it over to that video now.
My name is Matt Lutz. I'm the sheriff of Muskingum County here in Zanesville, Ohio. Some of the things that come to mind when you're talking about the Big Cat Public Safety Act is the fact that the farm that we had in our county, this couple was allowed to acquire and raise and breed a lot of exotic animals, but mostly a lot of big cats, including African lions and Bengal tigers. They were keeping these big cats in what I consider an oversized dog pen. And when somebody's allowed to do that, there are several issues that come up when you start talking about our community. And the first thing is the safety of our community.
Good evening. We begin tonight with a strange and sad story out of Zanesville, Ohio. It started with a local man known as something of an eccentric. He kept big exotic animals, the kind we see in zoos, until last night when he released the animals and took his own life. We have two reports tonight beginning at the scene.
You know, our deputies go through immense training, a lot of different training on how to handle emergencies, but handling exotic animals is not part of our training, and neither should it be.
9 male lions, 8 lionesses, 3 mountain lions, and 18 tigers. We don't go to the academy and get trained on how to deal with 300-pound Bengal tigers.
So that's the first thing that comes to mind when you try to start talking about acquiring these things, is the pressure that it puts on the local sheriff's office or local police departments. Not to mention that once we handled our situation, the stress and trauma that it caused each individual officer.
Police responding in the dark to protect the families in the area had no choice but to draw their weapons and bring down the animals. The 48 dead animals include 18 endangered Bengal tigers, and there are only about...
If we wouldn't have done what we did, and those animals would have gotten loose off of that farm and hurt somebody, if we would have had kids killed in our community, this would have been a whole different matter, and the trauma would have been, 1,000 times more than what it was. That's the whole key of why I'm supporting the Big Cat Public Safety Act. This is one of the easiest things that could be done to try to prevent this from happening again. It keeps the environment safer for our public safety and for our community. And so it's the law that has to pass, and this act will just give those public safety officials some bite in it to be able to do something and to keep the animal owners in compliance and to keep them safe, and in return keeping public safety and our citizens safe.
Thanks. So before I wrap up this discussion about the bill, I want to address two questions that I get asked a lot about this legislation. And the first one is, will this put zoos out of business? And the answer to that is no. It's certainly no accident that it has so much support from the zoo community. And I just want to emphasize again that every single zoo in the United States is exempt from the ban on private possession that this bill puts in place, because every single zoo possesses that USDA exhibitor's license. So zoos across the country would be able to keep big cats on display. They would still be able to breed them and transport them, everything you associate with the normal activity of a zoo. The only thing that zoos would not be able to do is allow the public to handle the cubs. And the second question I want to address is this something that should be handled at the state level instead of the federal level? And the answer to that is also no. State legislation is extremely important, and Angela laid out the fact that a lot of states have tried to address this problem at the state level, but it's simply impossible for individual states to address this in a comprehensive manner. as you saw earlier, state laws on this are inconsistent. There are 19 states that outlaw private ownership, but then the rest have some mixture of partial or no regulations. And it's pretty clear that this patchwork is failing to protect public safety, failing to protect animal welfare, and this points us in the direction of needing the federal government to step in and protect both humans and animals. And the Lacey Act, which this bill amends, gives the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service clear authority to regulate dangerous wildlife species, and that's exactly what this legislation asks the agency to do. So the final point I want to make is that this legislation obviously doesn't address every source of cruelty towards big cats. There are a lot of other measures that we're going to need to look at. We'll need to improve enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act. We'll need to place additional restrictions on how roadside zoos can treat the animals in their care, but those don't fall within the scope of this bill. And what the Big Cat Public Safety Act would do, ending cub petting and ending private ownership of big cats, would be a hugely meaningful step that would prevent an enormous amount of suffering. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate, and thank you to the rest of our excellent panel. We have about 15 minutes for questions, so I'll turn to the questions that attendees have been asking. If you still have a question and you have not asked it yet, please go ahead and use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll start with the one that I just saw. Matthew, this may be for you or Kate or any of the panelists. Were those Ohio owners who released the animals in Zanesville ever held accountable in a criminal or civil court? Of course, we know the story of the owner in Zanesville. I'll let you all explain that, but maybe go into a hypothetical of would he be now?
I'm happy to start. So for those of you who don't know the story of Zanesville, that owner, as soon as he let those animals out, he killed himself. So there was no accountability there, but also the state law at the time, there was no prohibition on owning those animals privately. And so there was no way for police to know that they were there. And then there would have been, I don't believe any legal action to be taken after the fact had he still been alive. Ohio has since passed a very comprehensive ban on exotic pet ownership, but as I said, that doesn't address the full scope of the federal problem.
Thanks, Kate. Did anybody else have anything they wanted to add to that? Okay, the next question is over animal rescues. Can you go into more detail the role sanctuaries play in animal rescues? I know that Ed has paused, but Angela also, her organization Born for USA runs a primate sanctuary, so I'll leave it to you two to answer that.
Sure. Well, Ed did a very good job of explaining the role that sanctuaries play in rescues. And, you know, in addition to the large scale or medium scale rescues where you're talking about multiple animals, sanctuaries are also involved in individual rescues. And that can be someone who has had a pet big cat, a monkey, any other type of animal that they have realized is not appropriate for the home. It may be as a result of them getting too big to be handled. It may be the result of a child or a family member being injured by them, and they seek a solution. And they will call on sanctuaries to help. So sanctuaries are a part of the solution both for individuals and in partnership with organizations such as ALDF and IFAW, who are conducting these investigations, litigating these, and rescuing the animals. I do want to say that we are a temporary solution in the sanctuary field. This is not the permanent solution. The permanent solution is to stop the problem so that sanctuaries no longer need to exist. And our role in this, in terms of the rescues, is providing lifetime care for these animals. So the rescue doesn't end. It's not a happy ending. It's not an ending at all when those animals arrive at the sanctuaries. They can have 10, 20, 30 more years of life in captivity with all of the costs and the care that need to be given during that lifetime. So we are part of the solution, and hopefully a temporary one when we all work together to end this trade to begin with.
Thanks, Angela. I'm gonna shift over to a question for Lisa. Lisa, what happened to the tiger cubs featured in the undercover investigation video by HSUS?
Both of the tiger cubs who were featured at our investigation at Tiger Safari, both were dead by the time they were 1.5 years old. When they aged out for cub petting, they were both put in a cage, separate cages at Tiger Safari, and both ultimately died. Maximus, we were told by a whistleblower, choked on a chicken bone. We don't know if that's the cause of his death or not. And then Sarabi died after being ill for quite a while and not receiving any veterinary care at all. At Natural Bridge Zoo, Dax and Deja, who were used for photo ops during that undercover investigation, were both sent to Doc Antle when they aged out, as the cubs who Natural Bridge Zoo had used the year before for public handling. That's what happened to them too. And all these tigers had originally been born to tigers who were owned by Doc Antle or on loan by Doc Antle. So we found with those two investigations, all roads led back to Doc Antle in South Carolina.
Thanks, Lisa. I now have, I've gotten a few questions on sanctuaries, so this will be for Ed. Sorry if you went over this already, but how are sanctuaries vetted? What are the regulations for sanctuaries? And in your answer, Ed, if you can go ahead and reiterate how the public can tell the difference between a pseudo sanctuary and a reputable sanctuary.
Well, the vetting, there was no vetting for a long time. We actually tried back in the 90s to get an organization formed that would vet sanctuaries, because every place called themselves sells a sanctuary. The 39 tigers we took, the name of the place was Tiger Rescue Sanctuary. So we wanted to draw a line between an authentic sanctuary and a pseudo sanctuary, and the first organization was the Organization of Sanctuary of Association, the Association of Sanctuaries, and it kind of morphed into the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries. And that, if you see that designation, it doesn't mean that every single sanctuary that isn't a GFAS sanctuary is not a good one. I'm sure there are plenty of good ones. I know some of the directors. But if you have a GFAS stamp of approval, or if you're part of the membership, you can bet that you have a good business plan, a solid business approach to the problem, to your future. It's much like the AZA accreditation of a zoo. And then there are stringent regulations for animal care also, and they do inspections. So if you see the GFAS insignia, that's a good sign right there. The difference between a pseudo sanctuary and a sanctuary is pretty simple. You know, at a sanctuary, we're not open to the public on a regular basis, but some places are. But the message from a sanctuary is about this problem that we're discussing today. The pseudo sanctuaries seem to talk vaguely about conservation and how they're saving tigers by breeding. The big one is no public contact. You can't have contact with the humans when you go to a real sanctuary. At a pseudo sanctuary, you can pet the cubs, and just a huge difference. So and then if you have any problems, any questions, get a hold of GFAS, and they can steer you in the right direction if there's any question after that.
Thanks, Ed. Meredith, I wanted to give you a chance to chime in on that as well, the vetting of sanctuaries and maybe your work on the Big Cat Sanctuary Alliance.
Sure, thank you. In 2017, IFA worked with legitimate sanctuaries to create an organization called the Big Cat Sanctuary Alliance. The alliance is currently made up of 16 sanctuaries. There are 14 big cat sanctuaries in the United States that are either verified or fully accredited by GFAS, and 12 of those are members of BCSA. We also have 5 non-sanctuary partners, including GFAS. Those are organizations that support the efforts to end the exploitation of big cats in captivity. And this organization works together to do advocacy, but also to help all sanctuaries improve their business practices and their animal care practices. They do a lot of information sharing and host annual conferences as well for educational purposes. That organization also has a dedicated rescue committee that has established clear operating procedures and decision-making guidelines that are available for all members to make sure that decision-making is transparent and quick when we coordinate on rescues.
Thanks so much, Meredith. I've gotten a few more questions on the bill. So Kate, these will go to you, but of course, other panelists, feel free to chime in with any additional information. Kate, the first one is on breeding. Is breeding allowed? Is it not covered by the bill? Could you go into that a little bit, please?
Sure. So breeding of big cats is not prohibited under the Big Cat Public Safety Act. Like I said, we're not trying to stop zoos from any of their normal activities. What we are hoping to accomplish with this legislation is ending the rampant breeding that is necessary in order to maintain a cub petting operation, invite the public in to handle these babies. And so to that end, we're just going directly to the problem and prohibiting that direct contact instead of saying, well, you can't breed for that purpose. So we believe that by ending these opportunities for the public to interact directly with these cubs, by ending that incentive to constantly be breeding big cats, that the amount of breeding in the United States will decrease.
Thanks, Kate. As a follow-up question on the bill and on the agency interaction altogether, do USDA inspectors ever contact the Fish and Wildlife Service if conditions for tigers and lions at roadside zoos are substandard? So Kate, I'll hand this one to you, but then other panelists feel free to chime in.
Sure, that's a great question because I didn't get into the distinction between the roles that each of these agencies play, but that's a really important point to make. So the USDA has the responsibility of enforcing the Animal Welfare Act. And this act requires exhibitors, so facilities that put warm-blooded animals on display, to have a Class C exhibitor's license and then undergo routine inspections where they check to see if those exhibitors are meeting certain fairly basic standards under the Animal Welfare Act. Nothing about that would change under this bill. This bill, instead of amending the Animal Welfare Act, it amends the Lacey Act. And it's the Fish and Wildlife Service that has the jurisdiction to enforce that law. And what Fish and Wildlife Service would be doing is ensuring that there's no private ownership and no cub petting. So this is not about standards that exhibitors must uphold. This is not about anything under the Animal Welfare Act. This is simply about enforcing those two separate pieces that fall under the Lacey Act. So to the question of whether the two agencies tend to contact each other, I don't personally have any evidence that there has been that collaboration before, but I think that there would be opportunities for improved enforcement if there was communication between the agencies if this bill passed.
Thanks, Kate.
If I could just add to that, yeah, I think that's a great point. And I don't know either of communications between the agencies, but our hope is that the victory in the Cricket Hollow Zoo case in establishing that the Endangered Species Act does apply to captive tigers, and of course most captive tigers are at USDA facilities, that kind of cross-agency collaboration could exist, and that when USDA inspectors, who are the ones on the ground at substandard roadside zoos, see conditions that violate the Animal Welfare Act, those conditions might also violate the Endangered Species Act or the Lacey Act, and create that opportunity for cross-agency communication and collaboration.
Great, thank you. Thank you both, great points. We have time for maybe one more question, maybe two. So Meredith, I'm gonna pivot to you for this one to go back to the subject of breeding in big cats. Are zoos breeding too many big cats? This is the question. So I wonder if you could go into a little bit the species survival plans that many AZA accredited zoos adopt versus the random breeding that we see at roadside zoos. The follow-up question on that is, since tigers are endangered, why wouldn't we want to breed more of them? So Meredith, if you're ready, I'll hand it over to you, and then I'll let other panelists chime in. It looks like Meredith might be having some technical difficulties. So do I have other panelists who want to weigh in on the breeding undertaken at AZA accredited zoos versus the random breeding we see at roadside zoos? Yep, go ahead, Lisa.
Roadside zoos are definitely breeding far too many tigers. Zoos that are accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums they are breeding tigers, but they have breeding programs that they call species survival plans that are very scientifically based. The breeding is very carefully controlled, who breeds with who, how many are produced, and there's just a world of difference between the two types of breeding, or where this breeding is taking place. Especially regarding the white tigers, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums Species Survival Plan condemns the breeding of white tigers because they realize and acknowledge that it serves no conservation purpose. So yes, roadside zoos and private breeders are breeding far too many tigers that are usually mixed subspecies, no regard for genetic lineage. The Association of Zoos and Aquariums have more responsible breeding programs that are very carefully controlled and don't produce the massive numbers that the roadside zoos are.
Thanks, Lisa. We now have Meredith back with us. Meredith, if you had anything to add to that?
I think I just wanted to add that the genetic question, I think, is the most important one here. I mean, we've talked about how white tigers are inbred, but even with the orange tigers, most of them are hybrids. There's 6 subspecies of tiger in the world. Most of the ones that are in roadside zoos in the US are hybrids, unlike at AZA accredited zoos, where they're doing a scientifically management breeding programs that are specific to the subspecies that they're working with.
Thank you so much. All right, it is now 4:30 on the dot, and we don't want to keep you any longer past 90 minutes. I believe we got to most of your questions, but if you have more questions, we'll be sending a follow-up email with the contact info for our panelists, as well as me, your moderator. We'll also be sending out a fact sheet on these issues, as well as information on the bill. I just want to thank our panelists one last time for taking the time and effort to participate in this webinar, and also thank everyone who was able to join today. We certainly appreciate your interest in these issues. If you're a Hill staffer and your office has yet to co-sponsor, please consider signing on to the Big Cat Public Safety Act. That's bill number HR 1380 in the House and S 2561 in the Senate. All right, that'll do it for us. Thanks again. Have a great rest of the week and stay safe. Thanks, everyone.